Well, what I saw as New York in 1993 was basically semi-third world city. I mean, with lots of poverty, with huge amounts of crime. This was the time when in Georgia people were shooting in the streets.
I'm Andrew Henderson from the sold-out Nomad Capitalist Live conference. Great to have with us here the former president of Georgia, the head of the President's National Reform Council in Ukraine, Mr. Mikheil Saakashvili. Pleasure, sir, to have you.
Hi, how are you, sir?
Big admirer of what you've done in Georgia. I want to start off with your being born in Tbilisi,
Yes.
1967, entirely different world. Talk about those early days.
Well, yeah, it's obviously the Soviet Union. It was the another world, another epoch, another mentality, another everything. I mean, it's but the way how the Soviet Union functioned is very different from the way how, for instance, today's Russia functions. It was the country where people were generally extremely well, politics didn't exist, but where economy didn't exist, but when there were parallel worlds, which meant that people were discussing politics anyway. They were very cynical of politics, and there was a parallel economy. There was parallel cash circulation, the parallel even big factories. People would produce, because there was shortage of product, their own underground factories products. They would exchange those products. These products would go, say, from Siberia to Odessa, from Odessa to Sukhumi, from Sukhumi to Tbilisi. But there were, because there was a shortage economy and central planned economy, there was a black market of goods which was quite efficient, and I knew lots of people who were very well off because of this situation. So it's part of the former Soviet society was well prepared for economic openings, and those black marketeers were the first one to embrace the some kind of freedoms that even the distorted form that perestroika gave them in of late Gorbachev years, plus the chaos of the 90s.
What did you take from that? Because it seems very intriguing. You grew up with the black market. That's what functions. What do you take from that?
No, what I take from my life experience in general, that any bureaucracy, any intervention from the state into economic or any other lives of citizens is not only counterproductive, they're destructive and they are disruptive, they are catastrophic sometimes, most of the times, because the point here is very simple. There's only a certain number of things states can do, and there are the other things that states just cannot do or should not be trying doing. Regulating economic life of citizens is none of their business. State's function is to create a situation of security, equality in terms of like people should not be trying to dominate the others. State should create the situation for democracy and for free electoral process, but the rest, it's not their thing. It's not up to bureaucrats to regulate, every single aspect of and I've seen it everywhere. It's not of economic activity, because I've seen it everywhere. I was shocked. My cousin was trying to open a bar in New York City a few years ago, and I was really so surprised, astonished, and at the same time, couldn't believe it. The amount of regulations they were asking for him. For instance, he had to show, the hours or the time of washing dishes or something like that, or that he was planning to do in his bar, in his kitchen, and he had to have separate permit for every almost water tap there. I mean, even Ukraine had not come to this yet. Well, one thing is that in New York it would not be such a major source of corruption, but it's a major source of trouble. In Ukraine, it would be people
Everyone has their
it
hand
would
out.
have been just raped through those regulations, like so. But the thing is, the end result is that it took him like 9 months to obtain all the permits and to start operating. And that should be like, I decide today to have bar, I have it by the end of this week, as long as it takes to bring in some things and, you know, maybe take one permit somewhere or inform someone with conditional beginning of work. That's what I believe in.
I would imagine that that makes you rather unpopular in politics. The nature of politics is we want to dominate people. We want to control their lives, no?
No, the thing with politicians is that they would like to feel power, and especially also with bureaucrats, and in that respect they are very similar, you know, where they say, oh, I'm a professional civil servant, I'm not a politician, but it's not true. The civil servants also depend very heavily upon politics, and they are power hungry just as much as politicians are. You know, I've seen it all around the world. Look, I've seen it of course, in Soviet Union, when I was harassed and briefly when arrested by KGB for anti-Soviet activities when I was a first-year student at Kiev University. But even in a free world, you know, like policeman stops you somewhere, like waves you, you drive cars somewhere, like in Phoenix, Arizona, or for that purpose in New York State, and then you see how slowly he comes to you with what a body language. Now here I am. Now I'll show you.
Right.
And then he starts to talk to you like he has all the things in his hands.
Only answer the way he wants to answer.
Your fate is in your hands, yeah. And that's what they want. Like this is this feeling of power, right? And so from that standpoint, you know, the only thing is that it's cutting their discretion, just eliminating it. When they have discretion, then they use this discretion to the detriment of the society. That's obvious for me.
That's who's attracted to this, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were in Kiev, you studied, you then went to study in the United States at Columbia.
Yeah. And George Washington University.
And George Washington. And what did that teach you? Because I imagine most people in that time were not doing that. That was a whole different mindset.
It was a very different mindset because it was early 90s. Well, it was 1993 actually when I first got accepted in 1992, to Harvard. But I decided not to go because we had civil war in Georgia, we had Russian intervention, and I thought that I could not just escape from my society, and I needed to contribute. But then, the year after, I took this opportunity. I went this time to Columbia Law School because they gave me tuition waiver, plus I had a congressional scholarship both in 92 and 93 to cover all my living expenses. Well, it was hard life because it was still very little money in New York City. And so New York City back then was not what I imagined from my childhood, because from my childhood it was in my perception, a paradise. Something that you could go to the place, and I heard about places like Times Square, Broadway, Fifth Avenue. You go there and embrace the paradise. Well, what I saw as New York in 1993 was basically semi-third world city. I mean, with lots of poverty, with huge amounts of crime. This was the time when in Georgia people were shooting in the streets. And you could hear, you know, at night you couldn't even sleep well until you heard a shot or two. But this was the same at the first days of Columbia residence, because it was next to Harlem, 116th Street, and this was time of drug wars. People were shooting at night, and so for me, study was very important because I saw the professors of whom I heard that they exist, but I never thought that would ever happen to see them alive. And now these were the guys that were my research supervisor, the guy who wrote a UN charter, Oscar Schachter, was my scientific supervisor, and he was conducting a seminar with me. We had 6 people in that seminar, and I wrote a paper on UN, for instance, as an example of how Colombia operated. I had a paper on UN peacekeeping, and then Oscar says, look, I had this guy whom I discovered in Africa and Ghana when I was going there as Deputy Secretary General of the UN. He was my interpreter. Then I brought him over to New York, so he's a good friend. And now he's working at the UN on UN peacekeeping. So why don't I bring over to our next class so that we can discuss together your paper? So that happened to be Kofi Annan, who was then the Undersecretary, but later the Secretary General. And you could get just anyone there. You could get all these Nobel laureates stuff. But besides that, there was this thing of readjusting and discovering this Western way of life, American way of life, consumer society. And that was, I don't know which one was more important, because I came in from the cold, from the woods, basically. And so I think the second part also took a big part from my studies, because I had to struggle and to discover, and the curiosity, it was so different from everything I had before. And so then I got my master's, and I decided I have to stay on, because it wasn't enough, because I spent most of that for a year at Columbia, discovering America beyond the process.
Yeah. We have hundreds of people here who I think in their home lives feel rather isolated, because nobody understands why they would want to leave the United States. And yet you hear so many stories such as yours. People come to the United States, come to other Western countries, and these days they just don't really measure up as much. What do you think about that?
Well, still the U.S. in the 90s was a politically very interesting place. I would go to Senate. I became instantly, I was a student, and I bonded instantly with John McCain, who was already a very important senator. I happened to meet people like, all kind of people, like briefly even Jesse Helms, but I met when I was a young parliamentarian, Edward Kennedy many times. Then we had Joe Lieberman, Joe Biden many times since the first time I met him in '96. And that Senate was very interesting, and that Congress. I mean, this was really this kind of grandeur of historic times. It's very different from what we have now in the U.S. What we have now. It was less partisan. It was still partisan, but it was not this kind of strong divide, and it was bigger. It had some bigger ambition and bigger scale. I think in some way it had diminished. I don't know I guess for all kind of reasons. The problem with U.S. politics is that it started to look more and more like Europe, and European politics is a disaster. It's a disarray, etc. It had something to do with, I still think, with temptation of more and more regulations coming into this thing. Well, Trump was in a way a revolt against that regulations, except that he didn't do much to get rid of most of them. Let's say he took certain steps, but he had no system. I also knew Trump very well since.
You brought Trump to Georgia.
Yeah, I brought him. I met him many times in New York. He would take me out to Broadway shows, and he even wanted to do a show with Georgian musicians, which he was like planning it for 6 months, and then he abruptly changed his mind. That also shows how he operated. The problem was that the guy all his life operated with his secretary Mona, with lawyer Mike Cohen, and with his kids. He was never head of something really big. I mean, okay. So suddenly here he was, and the chief executive office. So he just was not ready for this. I mean, that was obvious for me, knowing his background. But ideologically, that was the people revolted against the overwhelming presence of state and regulations. And then, of course, this revolt also has ugly face to it as well.
People aren't prepared for the ugly phase. And so, going back to when you returned from the U.S. to Georgia, you have political ambitions. You came into power at a very young age, in a time of great still upheaval. No, I mean, what were your ambitions, and how did that all start?
No, look, I was a young parliamentarian, as I told you, since the age of like 25 or 26. So I already had some background of trying to do some reforms in Georgia. We knew exactly what we wanted to. There was a big group of these young reformers that we wanted to get rid of old ways of corruption, but the way to get rid of corruption was to get rid of regulations and get rid of corrupt bureaucrats that had the discretion of corrupt bureaucrats, and any bureaucrat by definition was corrupt in Georgia because it was a feudal system, like it's a feudal system in Ukraine today and basically almost all other former Soviet states, because people get some position in government but they don't get paid. So they are told basically go and obtain your pay through other people's pockets. So and then they would rampage for those pockets as much as the laws and regulations allow them to do, right? So our thing was to eliminate that. So when we came in, the first thing we did was to set up a commission to cut old regulations, to destroy them. I brought a great libertarian and great thinker, Kaha Bendukidze, who was a big name not only in Russia, but where he was doing some business. He was not an oligarch because he was much more, way more poor than all the big business shots in Russia. He had something like $200 million, but compared to his big name there, it was nothing. When his buddies had like 20 billion plus. But the thing was that he was a libertarian, and he was a very convinced libertarian. He hated the idea that state would meddle into everything. So I put him in charge of commission to eliminate all the regulation. The way it would function, that every minister, he was kind of a super minister. He was Minister of Economy, so every other minister had to go and report to him and say, either they had to prove why this regulation exists in that ministry, or that regulation would automatically be abolished and cancelled within months. So they would come and say, well, if we don't do this and that, we'll have the fires, we'll have mass poisoning of people, we'll have we won't get any tax income, we will just basically go bankrupt as a state. And Kaha would very diligently explain to them that it was exactly the opposite. That if people, for instance, if you have food inspection that goes there to check the quality of food, then people, instead of investing into real quality of food, they invest into bribes to food inspection, because food inspection never checks anything except that they want to eat as well. If you have more visits you have from tax authorities and other kind of authorities, less taxes you collect, because that's where people just pay off these guys, and these guys are not interested in taxpayers to paying the state. So Kaha would just shut them off, and what he did, he's cut 70% of Georgia's regulation within roughly maybe maximum 2 months.
70% of the regulations?
Yeah, existing ones. And we kept cutting later as well, and we had this rule that which later was, by the way, done also by Canada, that if you introduce one new regulation, you had to cut 2 or 3 old ones, and it was a very hard process of bringing in new rules.
Trump had suggested that, I believe, but not so successfully.
The problem is that Trump had some of these ideas. I mean, Trump really admired what we were doing in Georgia. He said it many times openly. He spoke about it on the numerous U.S. channels that everything Georgia did, they should copy and do. But then what was done from that? Almost nothing.
So regulations were cut. Another thing that happened was taxes. As I recall, there were about 21 different main taxes, went down to something like 6.
Yes.
They were flattened.
Yes.
You can't change it. You can't raise it.
You can't change it. And what we also did was that we we've done at a later stage, because after Russian invasion of Georgia, we had to do something extraordinary. And the IMF was suggesting to raise taxes. And we did exactly the opposite. We cut VAT again by 2%, and then what we had the Economic Freedom Act, where we, as part of the Constitution, where we put that the rules could only be changed and the taxes could only be raised through a popular referendum, through a plebiscite.
So income tax. What kind of tax? They all have to be voted put it up.
Yes, what we did in the first months of my presidency was that when we came in, there was no money in the budget. We couldn't pay even that symbolic salary to civil servants. And we cut overall tax burden by 60%. And IMF immediately froze the program. They told us, you guys are crazy. You are bankrupt already, and now what you are doing, you are killing yourself. So we are gone. You know, they froze the program. You won't forget about cash. We're not giving anything under the suicidal whatever program. My assumption was at that moment when we were brainstorming, we said, well, if we could raise our tax income through cutting by 30% by the end of this year, then we are successful. Then we thought that it was doable. What happened actually that it doubled, and through the years of my presidency, Georgia's budget went up almost 12 times. In parallel, the economy increased 4 times, which means that budget increased faster than, so the tax collection increased faster than, but overall tax burden was cut by almost 70%. And that's the lesson I'm trying to educate Ukrainians about, because in Ukraine there is this thing, we now have, and we permanently have people in power there who say, oh, there are still more reserves we can take out from business, we can like really squeeze them. And they're saying this openly, like we should now liquidate this loophole and that loophole, and said, wait a minute, I mean, like, there is no way in Ukraine where you have taxes that exist there, there is no way you can exist there legally. Either we cut these taxes now, or if we cannot do, because we will die without money of IMF, but even for me, it's just an acrimony, because what IMF gives is $3 billion. Well, look, I mean, Ukraine can just cover this $3 billion just by cutting corruption in customs, for instance, by half. And here is, you no longer...
It's pretty bold, just to stand up to the IMF and all these organizations and say, we don't want you.
Yes, but the thing is, today, that's the problem with these countries. On the one hand, look, IMF is not a really good doctor, because you have like a finger problem. You need maybe a simple cream to treat it, and then the guy comes and he says, I'm a surgeon, I will cut your finger. That's what I can do, but the pain will be gone together with the finger. And that's what IMF does in many places. But the problem is that if you are yourself mistreating yourself so bad, in Ukraine's case, some of IMF's recommendations are good on corruption, anti-corruption, etc. They're good because Ukrainians themselves are not doing it. In Georgia, we did the opposite. We were doing our part of the work, and then when they came with bad part of their work, like saying cannot decrease taxes, you cannot remove this regulation, we said, wait a minute, we are producing results, and it's none of your business, the rest. And so we parted with them peacefully. After 1.5 years in Georgia, we told them, guys, okay, thank you for all your, or for like more than 10 years of your presence here, but we'll be on our own.
Does it upset them that you were able to succeed going the opposite way?
Yes, and they always find a way to say that there is something non-kosher about that. The most popular thing of European bureaucrats and IMF was saying that Saakashvili government is cutting corners. They are not following the advice. They are doing things that in long term can produce major risks. Something very vague, like.
It seems to be wrong a lot of the time with those long-term projections.
Yes, of course. But the thing was, here where he was, no country in the world increased the economy 4 times in 8 years as we did. We were 127th in terms of doing business on the World Bank ratings, and we went to being number 8 at the end of my presidency. So we were darlings of the World Bank.
From 127 to 8.
To 8, yes. So we were also darlings of the World Bank at the same time. So they produced a book which they promote throughout the world about the Georgia success. Usually the books that World Bank and IMF produce are about failures and why they happen. They're trying to explain what's the case study of failures. In our case, that was almost the sole exception when they were saying, well, these guys are successful, wow. So yeah, they are, in the end, the international organizations tried even not only acknowledge the final result, but they were kind of trying to take credit for that.
You've always had a good relationship with the U.S. Not only have you been there, there's a boulevard named after George W. Bush. You were a great friend of John McCain. I think one of 2 non-Georgians who was given the highest honor. But yet, as I recall, at the very beginning of your presidency, the U.S. was really more in the camp of the old guard and Sharavanadze, and you had to pull strings to bring them on.
Bureaucrats always are like that. Bureaucrats don't like change. They just don't. And if there is status quo, there is status quo. And if there is, and the main thing for them is we don't need trouble. We need to keep status quo, unless somebody else is making trouble for you as a country, and then you have political leadership directives that we should like really go and get them. That's one thing. But if nothing like that of that sort happens, I mean, who would care even if some country disappears from the map? I mean, if it doesn't create a big black hole that would sip on all the bad things from the world. So that's why I know how they function. I know how they malfunction. Bureaucrats all around the world, and U.S. bureaucracy is no exception. And so, but also what I've seen for years in that bureaucracy is that still in the 90s, they were faster in taking decisions. There was less red tape. Over years, it has increased, and it has increased naturally. As I said, America started to look more like Europe. They took more and more spheres to regulate. When I was in the US in the 90s, it was very different from, say, how I would go to Dutch bureaucrats back then. I mean, if you would go to Dutch City Hall, there would be no lines. Sometimes even they would smile at you, and more or less solve things fast. But you had to go there often and for many things. In US, you didn't have to go often. But once you had to go for something, say for Social Security card or something, it was a disaster. Like long lines, horrible buildings, lazy, rude, bureaucrats sitting there. So the concept of the U.S. is that you interact less with bureaucracy, but in case you have to, it's a disaster. And in Europe, you have to do it fast. What happened in the U.S. that you have to do it much more often. And the quality of bureaucracy has somehow a little bit increased, but not much.
Do you think it's getting worse?
Yes. Well, in terms of technologies, still it's computerized. Some things are easier to do it's not because of their will, but because technology has forced them to be, to cut red tape in certain procedures. But some people would argue it got worse, yes. So that's the problem. And when you have big machinery that doesn't want change, then whatever you do, they put up resistance. That's obvious for me.
Yeah, what was the resistance from the people? Because certainly now Georgia is more divided. And it seems like in countries where there are newer democracies or more open to, or newer to the ideas that you're talking about, some of the ideas aren't as easily accepted by the people. You'd think lower taxes, fewer regulations would be universally well regarded. Yeah,
well, that's my uphill battle in Ukraine, because in Ukraine I had the National Council of Reform, which is a body set by President Zelensky, which some kind of it's a side body for the government from where it's under the president, but it's a place where we gather together the prime minister, all the ministers, all heads of parliamentary factions, head of national bank, even prosecutor general, and we sit at one table and say we should change this, we should attack certain problem, all of us, and change it and reach consensus at this table, and then we send it to the parliament or change the regulation in the government, etc. And so the idea is good. But then the thing is, I was recently meeting business community in Western Ukraine, which was formerly part of Austro-Hungary, obviously, and and regions in Ukraine differ in their mentality because of that. You have like Cossacks in the middle of the country who hate every government regulation because no government brought them anything good, starting from old conquerors and also Stalin, who basically eliminated people through government regulations and through hunger. He killed 6 million Ukrainians. So for them, government is absolute blasphemy. Instinctively they don't like it. But then you have this Austro-Hungarian part where you had like this Franz Josef's bureaucracy, which was more or less orderly, very bureaucratic, but still it was not as abusive, right? So, and then I was meeting the business community, and then one local representative from some local council made a big, long speech about the fact that bureaucracy is good. And some people in the audience seem to agree. So bureaucracy is there to protect you. And I mean, Ukrainian bureaucracy is about everything but protection. They're just racketeers. But they have this and what do you say to such person? Like, what the hell? Or when there are some politicians who get votes by shouting, oh, we should squeeze them further. The real corruption is not in the government, but in business. They are the ones who are evading taxes. They are the ones who are neglecting that's why we don't have good roads. That's why we don't have this and that.
Isn't that the entire story of the United States and many Western countries today?
Yeah, but it's so wrong. I mean, It's from all our experiences. I mean, like more power you give them, we have less roads. More power you give, we'll have less infrastructure. I mean, yeah, if you talk the U.S., like airports in the U.S., what the hell is that?
Roads.
How can you not fix that part of it?
And yet many of the politicians...
How would for so many years that, from New York to even third world countries now have fast railways that are like 3 times faster than Amtrak that goes from DC, from New York. How could you not fix this for so many years? Like, what is so difficult about that? And when the people who couldn't fix it come and try to give you advice and they say, don't go so fast, you're cutting corners, well, there is some, contradiction in all that.
Well, that's who's running the U.S. and Sweden, and if you lower taxes, you're going to kill everything in their minds.
Yes, but I think the U.S. is founded on the idea of freedom, and here ultimately still this which will prevail. But also it is founded on idea of freedom, but also there is a migration process. Lots of different people come from different places. They have different cultural backgrounds, and of course it makes things very complicated. On the other hand, the U.S. has all these advantages. It's still a rule of law country. It's, you come from very lawless societies and people start very fast to abide by rules. So the main thing is to make those rules more normal, but more or less the fact that there is no cultural relativism at basic things. But once you go beyond basic things, then it starts. So you should not. You should create a system where there is no much discretion, because that's where all these cultural differences will be detrimental.
Is it easier, do you think, to turn around a small country, Georgia, 4 million
No,
people?
I would say Ukraine is of ideal size, which is for 40 million or so people, because in a small country it's much harder. I'll tell you why. Because if you're a country of 4 million people or so, everybody knows everyone else. We fired the entire bureaucracy almost. We have a capital where almost 1/3 of the country lives, and in that capital you got like 100,000 people in the downtown of the city, of like roughly 1.3 million people, that were fired by us. So you would meet them wherever you go, to restaurants, to cafes, to public meetings, but they would also come and rally all the time. And so we had to touch many interests, touching special interests, and was your neighbor, your close relative, etc. My theory is that a country under 1.5 million people is not reformable, but 40 million easily. If it has political will, because you start all this mechanism, you can fire the entire spectrum of bad guys and never see them again. And that's why I'm more enthusiastic about this side of the country. Of course, China would be unmanageable, but countries of middle size, they're
great to be a great power. I mean, they have the size to really be able to be a real player.
Absolutely.
You were, at the time that you left Georgia, came out of power, went to Ukraine, you got a position in Ukraine, became a Ukrainian citizen, lost Georgian citizenship, and then subsequently lost Ukraine. You were stateless for a while. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting experience, because I know that you guys are like promoting these multitudes of citizenship and multiplicity of citizenship. And in my case, and I know it was quite a new case, because I was maybe one of very few Ukrainians, maybe there are some others, who who got their citizenship, lost their citizenship, and got it back again. And I was a stateless person for more than 1.5 years. And it's hard, because as soon as I lost Ukrainian citizenship, I couldn't no longer use my bank cards from Ukraine. I couldn't access my account.
That was the difference we were talking about at dinner between the U.S. and Ukraine. I mean, the U.S., you keep using your bank accounts, but I was surprised. You said, I'm locked out.
Oh, totally locked out. You couldn't. In the U.S., at least, if the bank does want you, they will send you your money back in a check. Here, no, they just kept it. And so what you do, and then you have lots of things, like you go to airline counter and they say, well, we have to print your passport. Or what country are you from? I said, I have no country. And then they say, so how do we print you in? There is no code for this kind of thing. And every time they would go to their main manager, so I knew I had to come way before and to the airport to not to be left behind. So these kind of things that are, that are not normal people don't encounter there. But I've seen it. I've seen this part of it. I always remember there was a big fishing congress in South Africa, and I saw it on television, and Somali village delegated their representatives to that congress, and they were told, well, you cannot enter because this is like summit between the countries. And these guys were saying, can we not take part even if we don't have a real country, but we are still fishing and we need our rights protected. It's a hard situation when you are stateless, or when you don't really have a functioning state. But if you could benefit from different jurisdictions, that's something else.
So you are Ukrainian once again, and you would not recommend the statelessness process?
No, it's not fun. It's because it's like, the thing is that nobody wants you, so people stop to care about you. So I was thinking because I was carrying the stateless document from Netherlands to write, and I still have to do it, to write to Dutch Ministry of Justice, number of things why this document, which can easily be changed by them, to make this document functional. For instance, to get
stateless travel document.
Yes, for instance, like you go to some embassy for visa, and they wouldn't let you in because they only let in people with valid state passport, and this is not on their files. They can issue you a visa, but to get you that visa issued, you need to enter, and
you can't even get an appointment, basically.
Yeah, and that guard at the gate says, sorry guy, but you're not on my list because you cannot be on my list. Here is whom we allow in. So these are these things that, again, these are the things where no bureaucrat sat down and thought about it. And even if I write them, it will take them ages to change it. I know how this process functions there. Because again, they don't like change, even if it's obvious and it can be done in one day. In Georgia, we would do it like instantly.
As a business person, you constantly say, I can do this in an hour, in a day,
Yes,
in 5 minutes.
absolutely.
Why can't they don't want to?
Absolutely. They like the process, but they don't like the results. That's the main feature of any bureaucracy. And for instance, in case of Ukraine, of the entire political class. They are talking all the time to discredit every notion. They're talking about helping business, they're destroying business, they're talking about fighting corruption, they're aggravating corruption. And they're talking about reform, so people are sick. When you talk to them, we're called National Reform Council, but the word reform has been so discredited because every single anti-reformist, every single retrograde, every single corrupt bastard in the government and in political class was talking about reforms. So they learn to imitate words, process, terms, everything, but they know exactly how not to allow any result to actually materialize itself.
How do you define yourself in several words as a person, as Mikheil Saakashvili?
I always like change because I think that without change the world is going to hell. But change to simplify, open up, allow people to be free in real terms. Change in that direction. I like to my legacy in Georgia, in the Odessa region of Ukraine, or generally, I think, eventually in Ukraine and again in Georgia, should be that big groups of people say, this guy made our life easier. That's what really matters. That things that they are streamlined, it's easy, it's accessible. There was this guy once that did it. So that's ultimately what politics should be all about.
You might not get the credit at the time.
Yeah, making life easier for the people, like giving them opportunities. You cannot feed people, forget about it. But you can give them possibilities.
Would you call yourself a libertarian?
I believe I'm a libertarian in a sense that I don't believe in regulations beyond certain things. I believe in small state but strong state. I don't believe, some libertarians don't like any state at all. You need certain instrument, but this is a surgical instrument, and you don't normally do surgeries. You have to do your best not to do surgery. You have to treat it otherwise, and that's where I'm totally libertarian, yes. But on this small state component, I still believe it should be there for the security, for securing democracy, for keeping at bay really bad people with bad intentions. And these are not only terrorists or just some pedophiles. We are talking about people who have intention of intruding into lives of citizens in other ways. Through regulation, making things difficult, extracting their swindling money out of them through, again, the government schemes. And so this kind of state's function is also to neutralize that trend.
Lastly, will you return to Georgia? Will you be able to return to Georgia?
Oh, I'm sure I will be, because the thing is that Georgian society got vaccinated. Well, I had 4 times, economy under me grew 4 times. Poverty decreased 2.5 times. Georgia became the safest country in Europe from being one of the most unsafe ones in the world. We had, in terms of corruption, we were second or third least corrupt country in Europe according to the EU study. People saw this and then they opted for more. They wanted something more. Well, there is not something more, unfortunately. Now the economy grew in US dollars in 0% in the same amount of time under my predecessor. And under me it grew 4 times when we had world economic crisis and the Russian invasion. Like 2 most catastrophic circumstances you could encounter. So people saw the difference, and that if you see the difference, then it's easy. Before I would try to explain to them, it could become worse, but they wouldn't believe me because people always want to believe in nice fairy tales. Fine, that's the freedom. So what freedom is all about? Freedom is also experiencing your own, hitting the wall sometimes,
Seeing the results.
and getting the pain from that, but then remembering that then we should have maybe have gone the other way, and going the other way, even if they won't allow them to do this now, because I peacefully gave away power. In the U.S. Senate, several senators, when there was this trouble in January, cited Georgia as an example of peaceful transition of power. Georgia of 9 years ago of Saakashvili. I was mentioned by name, and it was like, and they say, well, it was in that country, Georgia. We were there, we contributed to it. Well, I let them believe so that they contribute to it. But then, which I mean, but the thing is that they were helpful and friendly, and that's still. But it was still my decision and our decision that we don't force people to do things. Right. We don't impose things. People, even if we see they're making mistake, very big tragic mistake, you don't stop them from doing that. That's how democracy functions, and that's how nations grow. And I think now we are grown-ups as a nation in Georgia, and it will help.
Well, we both share that. I'm sure there's some of the bureaucrats in the U.S. that would like me not to return, but I do wish you the best in getting back. And Mikheil Saakashvili, pleasure to have you.
Good luck to you.
So people ask, Andrew, how do I get the most out of Nomad Capitalist? How do I begin my Nomad Capitalist journey? The first thing people do is they start right where you're at. They watch YouTube, they listen to podcasts, they read articles at nomadcapitalist.com. We've spent years creating thousands of pieces of free content so that you can get the vibe from someone who's actually done this, from someone who's actually been in your shoes. What they'll do next, they'll get a copy of the book. You can find it on Amazon. It costs a few bucks, and while it's not going to give you all the secrets, it's going to, again, give you more of the vibe. You're going to learn a lot of the things that I've learned. You're going to learn some strategies you can employ, and you're going to get a lot further in your journey. From there, if you are the 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur investor, you can go to nomadcapitalist.com. You can click Become a Client. We're pretty busy these days, but we have availability to help a limited number of people who want to create a holistic plan, something that I think is so important. So if you want to do that, go to nomadcapitalist.com, click Become a Client, learn more about how it works and how we can help you.